Have you ever stepped between a bully and a child, knowing it could cost you everything? Maybe you're watching this from New York, Chicago, or somewhere else where protecting the innocent feels like a daily choice. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from, because tonight's story proves that sometimes one moment of courage can change absolutely everything. The dinner plates felt heavier tonight. Serena Castellano balanced 3 entrees on her left arm, while her right hand gripped the water pitcher so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 24 years old, and she'd been waitressing at Romano's for 8 months now. Long enough to know that Friday nights brought out the worst in both customers and management. Long enough to recognize the dangerous edge in Tony Ricci's voice when the restaurant got too busy. Her ribs still ached where Derek had kicked her 6 weeks ago, the last time she'd seen her ex-boyfriend. The bruises had faded to yellow-green smudges, hidden beneath her black uniform, but the memory of his rage stayed fresh. She'd escaped that night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the tips she'd managed to save. Starting over meant everything had to be perfect. She couldn't afford to lose this job. The dining room hummed with conversation and clinking silverware, Romano's upscale Italian atmosphere drawing wealthy clients who expected flawless service. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths, and the scent of garlic and basil drifted from the kitchen. Serena moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her smile automatic even when her feet screamed inside the cheap black shoes that were a size too small. She was refilling wine glasses at table 12 when she noticed the little girl. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, standing just inside the restaurant's entrance with wide, frightened eyes. Her school uniform was wrinkled and her backpack hung from one shoulder, sliding down her thin frame. She looked lost, scanning the crowded dining room as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Serena's heart clenched. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself more times than she could count, waiting for her own father who never showed, who always had something more important than his daughter's school play or birthday dinner. The child took a tentative step forward, clearly overwhelmed by the noise and elegant surroundings. She clutched a small piece of paper in her hand, probably an address or phone number. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, and Serena watched her struggle not to cry in a room full of strangers. That's when Tony noticed her. Tony Ricci stood barely 5 feet 6 inches but made up for his lack of height with an abundance of cruelty. His thinning black hair was slicked back with too much gel, and his narrow face always seemed twisted in irritation. He ruled the dining room like a petty tyrant, berating servers for minor infractions and taking his frustrations out on anyone he perceived as beneath him. Serena had learned to stay invisible around him, to anticipate his moods and avoid his attention whenever possible. But Tony's attention was now fixed entirely on the little girl, and Serena could see the storm building in his expression. He strode across the dining room with quick, angry steps, his voice rising above the dinner conversation. "Get out of here," he snapped at the child, waving his hands dismissively. "This is a restaurant, not a playground. You can't just wander in here disrupting our customers." The little girl stepped backward, bumping into a decorative plant near the entrance. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm looking for my papa. He said he'd be here, but I don't see him." Tony moved closer, towering over her despite his short stature. His face had turned red, the way it always did when he was about to lose his temper completely. "I don't care what your father said," he hissed. "You're bothering people who are trying to enjoy their dinner. Security will throw you out if you don't leave right now." The child's lower lip trembled, and she hugged her backpack tighter against her chest. "But Papa said Romano's," she said, holding up the piece of paper with shaking hands. "He wrote it down for me. He always comes to get me after school. But today he's late and I'm scared." Serena felt something snap inside her chest. The water pitcher slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. She didn't even notice the water spreading around her feet or the annoyed looks from nearby diners. All she could see was this terrified child being bullied by a grown man who should have known better. She moved without thinking, crossing the dining room in quick strides and positioning herself directly between Tony and the little girl. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice came out steady and clear. "She's just a child, Tony. She's scared and looking for her father. There's no need to shout at her." Tony's eyes went wide with surprise, then narrowed with fury. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a waitress he considered expendable. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did I ask for your opinion? Serena? Get back to your tables before you join her on the street." Serena felt the familiar flutter of panic in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had countless times with Derek. The urge to apologize, to back down, to make herself small and invisible. But she looked down at the little girl, who was now standing slightly behind her legs, and felt something else entirely. Something fierce and protective that had nothing to do with self-preservation. "No," she said quietly, "I won't watch you terrify a child." Behind her, the little girl sniffled softly. She reached out tentatively and touched Serena's hand, her small fingers cold and trembling. "Thank you," she whispered in accented English. "Papa always says there are good people and bad people, and you must be one of the good ones." Tony's face had progressed from red to purple. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Serena could see the violence building in his expression. She'd seen that look before, knew what came next. But she didn't move. She couldn't. This child needed someone to stand between her and the anger of adults who had forgotten what it felt like to be small and afraid. "You're fired," Tony snarled, loud enough that several nearby tables turned to stare. "Clear out your locker tonight. And you," he said, pointing at the little girl, "get out of my restaurant before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The child pressed closer to Serena's legs, her breathing quick and frightened. Serena reached back and rested her hand gently on the girl's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. "My name is Serena," she said softly, not taking her eyes off Tony. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Isabella," the little girl whispered. "Isabella Torino. My papa owns lots of businesses, and he's never late. Something must be wrong." Tony grabbed Serena's arm suddenly, his fingers digging into the spot where her uniform sleeve covered the fading bruises Derek had left. She gasped, more from the memory than the pain, but didn't pull away. His grip was tight enough to leave new marks, and his face was inches from hers when he spoke. "You think you're some kind of hero," he hissed, "but you're nothing. You're a nobody waitress who just threw away the only job you could get. Nobody else will hire you after I'm done telling them what a troublemaker you are." From the corner booth in the restaurant's most secluded section, a man had been watching the entire confrontation unfold with growing interest. Dominic Torino sat perfectly still, his expensive suit immaculate despite the late hour, his green-gray eyes fixed on the scene playing out 20 feet from his table. He'd been conducting a business meeting, the kind that required privacy and careful words, but his attention had shifted completely the moment he'd heard his daughter's name. He recognized Isabella immediately, of course. His 80-year-old daughter with her mother's delicate features and his own stubborn determination. But what held his attention was the young woman who had positioned herself like a shield between Isabella and the enraged manager, who was speaking to his daughter with such gentle kindness even while being threatened with termination. Dominic studied the waitress carefully. She was lovely in an understated way, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Italian heritage. But it was her courage that impressed him. She could have looked the other way, could have let someone else deal with an inconvenient child. Instead, she'd risked her livelihood to protect a stranger's daughter. His daughter, the most precious thing in his world. The manager's voice rose again, crude and threatening, and Dominic saw Isabella flinch against the waitress's protective embrace. He also noticed the way the young woman winced when the manager grabbed her arm, as if she'd been hurt there before. Interesting, and problematic if his suspicions were correct. Dominic rose from his seat with fluid grace, his movements drawing immediate attention from the two men seated across from him. The meeting would have to wait. His daughter needed him, and this brave young woman had just unknowingly stepped into his world. As he approached the confrontation, Isabella's face lit up with relief and joy. "Papa!" she cried, breaking away from Serena to run toward him. "You came. I was so scared, But this nice lady protected me from the mean man. Dominic caught his daughter easily, lifting her into his arms while his gaze shifted to study the waitress who had risked everything for a child she'd never met. The manager had released her arm and stepped back, his face going pale as recognition dawned. Everyone in this neighborhood knew who Dominic Torino was, even if they didn't know the full extent of his business operations. But the waitress, Serena, was looking at him with confusion rather than fear. She didn't know yet what she'd stumbled into, didn't understand that the 80-year-old child she'd protected belonged to one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. All she saw was a father reunited with his daughter, and the relief in her expression was genuine and unguarded. For the first time in years, Dominic found himself curious about someone outside his immediate circle. This young woman had shown courage, compassion, and an instinct to protect the innocent that he recognized and respected. She'd also clearly been hurt by someone recently, if her reaction to the manager's rough handling was any indication. As he held Isabella close and met Serena's startled gaze, Dominic made a decision that would change both their lives forever. This woman had protected what mattered most to him. Now it was his turn to protect her. The man approaching them moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made everyone in the restaurant instinctively step aside. Serena had been so focused on protecting Isabella and standing up to Tony that she hadn't noticed him rising from the corner booth, hadn't seen the way other diners glanced at him with recognition and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Papa!" Isabella cried, breaking away from Serena's protective embrace and running toward him with obvious relief and joy. Serena watched in amazement as the little girl launched herself into the arms of a man who looked like he'd stepped off the pages of a luxury magazine. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2, with broad shoulders that filled out his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His dark hair was styled with casual precision, and his olive complexion suggested the same Italian heritage as his daughter. But it was his eyes that caught Serena's attention, green-gray and intense, the kind of eyes that seemed to see everything and miss nothing. He caught Isabella easily, lifting her against his chest with the practiced ease of a devoted father. His entire demeanor softened as he held his daughter, one large hand smoothing her dark hair while he murmured something in Italian that made her giggle despite her earlier tears. "I was so scared, Papa," Isabella said, switching back to English and pressing her face against his shoulder. "But this nice lady, Serena, she protected me from the mean man who was yelling. She was very brave, just like you always tell me to be." The man's gaze shifted to Serena, and she felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. His eyes were measuring, intelligent, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could read everything about her in a single look. Up close, she could see the expensive quality of his clothing, the platinum watch on his wrist, the subtle signs of wealth that marked him as someone far above her social circle. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that made even those simple words sound elegant. His eyes never left her face as he spoke. "It seems my daughter was fortunate to have someone willing to stand up for her." Before Serena could respond, Tony's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Oh God, Mr. Torino, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize Isabella was your daughter. If I had known, I never would have." The manager's face had gone from angry red to ashen white in a matter of seconds, and his hands were actually shaking as he approached them. Serena felt a chill run down her spine. The transformation in Tony's behavior was so complete, so immediate, that it told her everything she needed to know about exactly who Isabella's father was. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman. This was someone with real power, the kind of power that made bullies like Tony Ricci cower and stammer apologies. Dominic Torino set Isabella down gently, but kept one protective hand on her shoulder as he turned his full attention to the manager. His expression hadn't changed, but something in the air around him had shifted, become colder and infinitely more dangerous. "You didn't know she was my daughter," Dominic said, his voice still quiet but carrying an undertone that made even nearby diners stop their conversations. "But you knew she was a frightened child looking for her father. That should have been enough." Tony's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Mr. Torino, please, I was just trying to maintain order in the restaurant." We have policies about unaccompanied children, and I was simply following procedure. Dominic took a single step closer to Tony, and the manager actually stumbled backward. Your procedure, Dominic said, each word precisely enunciated, involved shouting at an 80-year-old girl and grabbing my employee hard enough to leave bruises. He glanced meaningfully at Serena's arm, where Tony's fingerprints were already beginning to darken her olive skin. Serena's heart hammered against her ribs as the implications of what was happening sank in. This man, Isabella's father, had been watching the entire confrontation. He'd seen Tony's aggression, her intervention, everything. And now Tony looked like he was about to faint from fear, which meant that Dominic Torino was someone whose anger had serious consequences. I witnessed the entire incident from my table, Dominic continued, his tone conversational despite the menace underlying every word. I saw how you treated my daughter. I saw how you treated Miss Castellano when she showed more decency and courage than you've demonstrated in your entire career. Tony's face was now a sickly green color. Mr. Torino, I can explain. There were extenuating circumstances. The dinner rush was overwhelming tonight, and mistakes were made. If I could just speak with you privately about this matter. There's nothing to discuss privately, Dominic replied. Miss Castellano risked her job to protect a child she'd never met. She showed exactly the kind of character and courage I value. You, on the other hand, showed exactly the kind of behavior I find unacceptable. Serena felt dizzy. The adrenaline from her confrontation with Tony was wearing off, replaced by a growing awareness that she was completely out of her depth. She'd somehow stumbled into the middle of something much bigger than a workplace dispute, and she had no idea what the consequences might be. Isabella tugged on her father's jacket and whispered something in Italian. Dominic's expression softened as he listened to his daughter. Then he looked back at Serena with something that might have been approval. My daughter wants me to thank you properly, he said. She's quite impressed with your willingness to protect her, and frankly, so am I. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, extending it toward her with steady fingers. I'd like to speak with you when you're finished with your shift tonight. Serena took the card with trembling hands, glancing down at the elegant black lettering. Torino Security Consulting. Dominic Torino, President. There was a phone number but no address, and the cardstock felt expensive between her fingers. I should get back to work, she said quietly, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. My other tables are probably wondering where I've been. Actually, Tony interrupted, his voice high and strained. Serena's shift is ending early tonight. We're overstaffed for the remainder of the evening, so her services won't be needed. Both Serena and Dominic turned to look at the manager, and Serena felt her heart sink. She could hear the dismissal in Tony's voice, the careful way he was phrasing her termination to avoid saying the actual words in front of someone who clearly scared him. I see, Dominic said slowly. How convenient. And I suppose Miss Castellano's employment here is also ending tonight? Tony swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. There have been some performance issues recently. Nothing personal, you understand, just business decisions that need to be made. Isabella looked up at her father with wide, confused eyes. Papa, does this mean Serena can't work here anymore? But she was protecting me. Why would they punish someone for being good? Out of the mouths of babes? Dominic murmured, and Serena caught the edge of cold anger in his voice despite his gentle tone with his daughter. It's a very good question, Principessa. Why would they punish someone for being good? The endearment made Serena's heart clench. She could see the genuine love between father and daughter, could see how Isabella's innocence and trust affected her father's carefully controlled demeanor. Whatever else Dominic Torino might be, he was clearly a devoted parent who would do anything to protect his child. I should go, Serena said, stepping back from the tense tableau. Isabella, it was wonderful to meet you. You're a very brave girl, and your papa is lucky to have such a smart daughter. Isabella beamed at the compliment, then surprised Serena by wrapping her small arms around her waist in an impulsive hug. Thank you for protecting me, she said seriously. Papa always says we should remember the people who help us when we need it most. Serena returned the hug gently, touched by the child's warmth and sincerity. You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. Anyone would have done the same thing. But as she looked up and met Dominic's intense gaze, she realized that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have risked their jobs to protect a stranger's child. Most people would have looked the other way and minded their own business. She'd acted on instinct, on a protective impulse she couldn't have ignored even if she'd tried. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Serena tried to focus on her remaining tables, but her hands shook as she poured water and took orders. She could feel Dominic watching her from his corner booth, where he'd returned with Isabella and resumed what looked like a business dinner with two other well-dressed men. Every time she glanced in his direction, she found his eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter with nerves. Isabella had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder, exhausted by the evening's drama. But Dominic remained alert and focused even as he conducted quiet conversations with his associates. Serena noticed how the other diners gave his table a wide berth, how the waitstaff moved carefully around that section of the restaurant. Everything about the man suggested danger wrapped in expensive suits and polite manners. When her shift officially ended at 11, Serena gathered her purse from her locker with shaking hands. Tony had left her final paycheck on the break room table along with a note that made her blood run cold. Consider yourself lucky that Mr. Torino was here tonight. Cross me again and you'll find out what happens to waitresses who don't know their place. I've got friends in every restaurant in this neighborhood, and none of them will hire troublemakers. The parking garage beneath Romano's was dimly lit and mostly empty when Serena finally made her way to her beat-up Honda Civic. Her feet ached from the ill-fitting shoes, and her arm throbbed where Tony had grabbed her. She was fishing for her keys in the bottom of her purse when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Miss Castellano. She turned to find Dominic Torino walking toward her, his daughter asleep in his arms. He'd taken off his suit jacket and draped it over Isabella's small form, and his white dress shirt was rolled up at the sleeves. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the garage, he looked perfectly composed and impossibly elegant. Mr. Torino, she said, proud that her voice came out steady. I didn't expect to see you again tonight. I wanted to thank you properly, he said, stopping a few feet away from her car. What you did for Isabella tonight, it means more than you know. She's the most important thing in my world, and you protected her without hesitation. Serena shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. Any decent person would have done the same thing. She's a sweet little girl, and she was scared. Tony was completely out of line. Not everyone would have risked their job, Dominic said quietly. Not everyone would have stood up to a man twice their size to protect a child they'd never met. That kind of courage is rare, and it should be rewarded, not punished. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and withdrew another business card, this one with different information written on the back in precise handwriting. That's my private number, he said, extending it toward her. If you need anything at all, I want you to call me. Serena hesitated before taking the card. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Torino, but I'll be fine. I'll find another job. This isn't your problem to solve. Isabella stirred in his arms and mumbled something in Italian, her small hand clutching at his shirt. Dominic's expression softened as he adjusted his hold on his daughter, and Serena felt something twist in her chest at the sight of such tenderness from such a clearly dangerous man. Perhaps not, he said, meeting her eyes again. But you made my daughter's problem your problem tonight. The least I can do is return the favor. The offer stands, Miss Castellano. Day or night, if you need help, call that number. Serena clutched the card in her trembling fingers, uncertain what to say. Every instinct told her to run, to get as far away as possible from this man and whatever world he inhabited. But another part of her, a part that had felt safer in his presence than she had in months, whispered that maybe, just maybe, accepting his help wouldn't be the worst decision she could make. Thank you, she said finally. I'll keep that in mind. Dominic nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal some kind of unspoken agreement between them. Then he was walking away, carrying his sleeping daughter toward a black luxury sedan that had appeared silently in the garage while they'd been talking. Serena watched until the taillights disappeared up the ramp, then looked down at the business card in her hands and wondered what she'd just gotten herself into. 3 days after losing her job at Romano's, Serena sat at her tiny kitchen table surrounded by rejection letters and unpaid bills, staring at Dominic Torino's business card like it might burst into flames. The elegant black lettering seemed to mock her from where she'd propped it against her nearly empty coffee mug. His private number written on the back in precise handwriting that suggested control and attention to detail. She'd tried everything else first, swallowed her pride and visited every restaurant, cafe, and diner within a 10-mile radius of her cramped studio apartment. The pattern was always the same. The manager would glance at her application, ask where she'd worked most recently, then suddenly find reasons why they weren't hiring after all. Word traveled fast in the restaurant industry, especially when someone like Tony Ricci had connections and an axe to grind. Her landlord had been by that morning, his heavy knock making her jump even though she'd been expecting him. The eviction notice was now taped to her refrigerator next to her past-due electric bill, and the empty prescription bottle she couldn't afford to refill. 48 hours. That's how much time she had left before she'd be sleeping in her Honda Civic again. Just like those terrible weeks right after she'd escaped from Derek. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd finally found the courage to protect someone else's child, and now she was about to become homeless. Derek would probably laugh if he knew, would say it served her right for sticking her nose where it didn't belong. She could almost hear his voice, that cruel edge he got when he wanted to remind her how worthless she was, how lucky she'd been that someone like him had even bothered with damaged goods like her. But she wasn't damaged goods. Was she? Serena picked up the business card with trembling fingers, remembering the way Isabella had hugged her so trustingly, the way Dominic had looked at her with something that might have been respect. She'd felt stronger in those moments than she had in months. Like the woman she used to be before Derek had systematically destroyed her confidence and isolated her from everyone who cared about her. Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed the number written on the back of the card. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Torino Security Consulting, this is Marcus speaking. How may I direct your call? Serena cleared her throat, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. I'd like to speak with Mr. Torino, please. This is Serena Castellano calling. One moment, Miss Castellano. Mr. Torino is expecting your call. The line went quiet for barely 10 seconds before a familiar voice came on, warm and slightly accented. Serena, I was hoping you'd call. Mr. Torino, she said, gripping the phone tighter. I'm sorry to bother you, but I think I need to take you up on your offer for help. Things have gotten a bit complicated since the other night. Tony's been busy, I assume, Dominic said, and she could hear the edge of controlled anger in his voice. I had a feeling he might try to make things difficult for you. Where are you right now? At my apartment, she admitted, but not for much longer. It seems that standing up to restaurant managers doesn't pay the rent. Give me your address. I'll send a car for you in 20 minutes. We should discuss your options in person. Serena rattled off her address before she could second-guess herself, then spent the next 20 minutes trying to make herself presentable with the limited contents of her closet. She settled on a simple black dress that didn't show too much wear, and the one pair of shoes she owned that didn't have holes in the soles. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who was trying hard to look professional despite the dark circles under her eyes and the stress lines that had appeared around her mouth over the past few months. The car that arrived was exactly what she'd expected from someone like Dominic Torino. Sleek, black, and expensive, with windows tinted dark enough that she couldn't see inside. The driver was a mountain of a man in a perfectly tailored suit, who held the door for her with surprising gentleness and called her Miss Castellano like she was someone important. Torino Security Consulting occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, the kind of building where the marble floors were polished to a mirror shine and the elevator required a key card for access. Serena felt completely out of place as she was escorted through hallways lined with abstract art and into a reception area that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Mr. Torino will see you now, the receptionist said, gesturing toward double doors made of rich, dark wood. Dominic's office was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, and his desk looked like it had been carved from a single piece of ebony. But what caught Serena's attention was the collection of framed photographs arranged carefully on a side table. Isabella at various ages, laughing, playing, hugging the man who clearly adored her. These weren't formal portraits but candid shots that revealed the genuine love between father and daughter. "Please, sit," Dominic said, rising from behind his desk and gesturing to a comfortable chair positioned across from him. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, and his green-gray eyes were as intense as she remembered. "You look tired," he observed, his tone gentle but direct. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Serena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm fine," she lied automatically. The same response she'd given Derek countless times when he demanded to know why she looked so pathetic, why she couldn't take better care of herself. Dominic studied her for a moment, then pressed a button on his desk phone. "Marcus, please have someone bring us lunch from that Italian place on 5th Street. Something substantial. And coffee, the good kind." "You don't need to do that," Serena protested. "I just came to ask about work. Maybe a reference or a loan until I can get back on my feet. When Marcus told me you'd called, I realized I hadn't been entirely honest with you the other night," Dominic said, settling back in his chair but keeping his attention focused entirely on her. "I said I wanted to thank you for protecting Isabella, which is true, but I also have a proposition that might benefit both of us." Before Serena could ask what he meant, the office door burst open and a familiar voice called out in accented English. "Papa, is she here? Did Serena really come to visit us?" Isabella bounded into the room wearing a school uniform and carrying a backpack covered in colorful patches. Her face lit up with pure joy when she spotted Serena, and she immediately launched herself across the room for another one of her enthusiastic hugs. "You came," Isabella said, wrapping her arms around Serena's waist. "I told Papa you would. I told him you were special and that you'd come back because good people always keep their promises, even when they don't say the promises out loud." Serena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she returned the little girl's embrace. Isabella smelled like strawberry shampoo and playground chalk, innocence and trust in a world that had taught Serena to expect neither. "She's perfect," Serena thought, looking over Isabella's head to meet Dominic's watchful gaze. "This little girl is absolutely perfect, and she needs someone to protect her from all the ugliness in the world." Isabella pulled back and looked up at Serena with serious dark eyes that reminded her strongly of her father. "Are you going to come live with us? Papa said maybe you could be my nanny, but I told him you're more than that. You're my protector just like he is, except you're nice about it and you smell like flowers instead of expensive cologne that makes me sneeze." Dominic cleared his throat, but Serena caught the amused smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Isabella, cara mia, perhaps we should let Serena hear the whole offer before you start planning where she'll sleep." "But I already know where she'll sleep," Isabella said matter-of-factly. "In the room next to mine so she can help me with my nightmares and teach me how to be brave like her. Mrs. Chun is very nice, but she doesn't understand about being scared of men who yell, and sometimes I need someone who knows about that." The words hit Serena like a physical blow. How could an 80-year-old be so perceptive, so aware of the trauma that Serena thought she'd hidden so well? She looked at Dominic and saw her own surprise reflected in his expression, followed quickly by concern and something that looked like protective fury. "Isabella," Dominic said carefully, "what do you mean about men who yell?" The little girl shrugged with the casual honesty of childhood. Serena was scared when the mean manager grabbed her, but she didn't run away. She stayed to protect me even though she was scared, which means she knows about bad men who hurt people. "I can tell these things, Papa. Mama always said I was good at reading people's feelings." Serena felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that terrified her. But she also felt something else, something warm and protective that had nothing to do with her own fears. This child needed her. Isabella had somehow recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it felt like to be afraid but had found the courage to act anyway. "My proposal," Dominic said quietly, his eyes never leaving Serena's face, "is for you to become Isabella's companion and tutor. Mrs. Chun handles the household management and cooking, but what Isabella needs is someone who can provide emotional support and guidance. Someone who understands that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared." The offer was more than Serena had dared to hope for, steady employment, a chance to help a child who clearly needed female influence, and the protection of a man who could solve her immediate problems with a single phone call. But accepting meant entering a world she didn't understand, working for someone whose power and danger she could sense but not quantify. "Papa," Isabella said suddenly, turning to her father with the kind of determination that suggested she'd inherited his strength of will. "If Serena says yes, can she start tonight? I have math homework, and she looks like she's really good at math. Plus, Mrs. Chun is visiting her sister this weekend, and I don't want to be alone with just the security guards." Serena looked between father and daughter and felt her resistance crumble. Isabella needed her, not just for homework help or companionship, but for the kind of understanding that came from shared experience. And Dominic, despite his obvious wealth and power, was clearly struggling to provide his daughter with something he couldn't give her himself: emotional support from someone who understood what it meant to be vulnerable in a world full of people who might hurt you. "Yes," Serena said quietly, the word escaping before she could stop it. "If the offer is genuine, if you really think I can help Isabella, then yes. I'd like to try." Isabella whooped with joy and spun around the office like a tiny tornado. "Papa, she did it. She said yes. Now we can show her my room and my books, and she can help me practice piano, and maybe she can teach me how to braid hair the fancy way." Dominic stood and extended his hand to Serena, his smile genuine and warm. "Welcome to the family, Serena. I have a feeling you're going to fit in perfectly." As Serena shook his hand and felt the strength and warmth of his grip, she thought about the eviction notice taped to her refrigerator and the empty prescription bottle that represented months of struggling alone. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she might actually be safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, valued and needed and protected by people who saw her as more than just another disposable waitress. The penthouse apartment that Dominic called home took Serena's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of Lake Michigan, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum rather than someone's living room. But it was Isabella's bedroom that really impressed her. Walls lined with bookshelves and a reading nook filled with soft cushions and fairy lights. This was the room of a child who was loved deeply and encouraged to dream big. That first evening, as she helped Isabella with homework at the kitchen table while Dominic watched from the doorway, Serena felt something settle inside her chest that she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Safety. The knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, protecting someone who needed protection and being valued for who she was rather than criticized for who she wasn't. When Isabella woke up crying from a nightmare about the mean manager at the restaurant, Serena was the one who rushed to her bedside, who held her gently and whispered reassurances until the little girl's breathing slowed and her grip on Serena's hand finally relaxed. Dominic appeared in the doorway, watching silently as Serena soothed his daughter back to sleep, and the look in his eyes suggested that he understood exactly how precious this moment was. "Welcome home," Serena told herself as she tucked Isabella's blankets around her small frame and smoothed her dark hair away from her peaceful face. After months of running and hiding and feeling worthless, she was finally truly home. 2 weeks into her new life as Isabella's companion, Serena was finally beginning to understand the true scope of Dominic Torino's world. It wasn't just the penthouse apartment with its museum-quality art and panoramic views, or the fact that groceries appeared like magic without her ever seeing them delivered. It was the way his drivers wore earpieces and kept their hands positioned near concealed weapons. It was the armored plating she'd glimpsed when one of the car doors hung open too long. It was the casual conversations he had in rapid Italian that stopped abruptly whenever she entered the room. Dominic Torino wasn't just a successful businessman. He was someone who needed bulletproof glass and armed escorts, someone whose enemies might target his daughter to get to him. And now, by extension, someone whose protection extended to a former waitress who'd stumbled into his family through an act of instinctive courage. Serena had fallen into a comfortable routine with Isabella, helping with homework in the afternoons and reading bedtime stories that often stretched into long conversations about everything from mathematics to mythology. The little girl was brilliant, curious, and surprisingly perceptive about the adult world around her. She never asked directly why her father needed so much security, but she understood that their life was different from other families, that certain precautions were necessary to keep them safe. What Isabella didn't understand, and what Serena prayed she'd never have to learn, was that the past had a way of catching up with people no matter how far they ran or how well they tried to hide. Derek Lawson had always been good at finding things that didn't want to be found, especially when those things belonged to him. And despite everything that had happened, despite the restraining order and the new phone number and the carefully constructed new life she'd built, Derek still considered Serena his property. The first text message arrived on a Thursday morning while she was helping Isabella practice piano. Her phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and she glanced at it absently before her blood turned to ice in her veins. Unknown number, but she knew that writing style, that particular combination of threats and endearments that had terrorized her for 2 years. Found your new job, baby. Nice upgrade from waitressing. Guess you learned how to use what God gave you after all. Too bad your new boyfriend doesn't know what damaged goods he's dealing with. We need to talk. Serena's hands began to shake so violently that she had to grip the edge of the piano bench to steady herself. Isabella looked up from the keys with concern, her dark eyes so much like her father's that Serena felt a stab of protective fear that had nothing to do with her own safety. Are you okay, Serena? You look like you saw something scary. I'm fine, sweetheart, Serena managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. Just a work message that surprised me. Why don't we take a break from piano and work on your science project instead? But she wasn't fine. Over the next 3 days, the messages escalated in both frequency and menace. Derek had somehow tracked down her employment with the Torino family, had probably followed her or hired someone to watch her movements. He knew about the penthouse, about Isabella, about the comfortable life she'd found with them. Worse, he seemed to think that Dominic was her boyfriend rather than her employer, and Derek's jealousy had always been his most dangerous emotion. By Saturday evening, Serena was jumping at every unexpected sound and checking her phone compulsively. She changed her ringtone to silent, but the constant vibration of incoming threats was wearing down her nerves like water dripping on stone. Derek was getting bolder, more specific in his knowledge of her daily routine. He knew what time she walked Isabella to school, knew which grocery store she preferred, knew things that suggested he was watching from somewhere close by. Dominic noticed, of course. He was far too observant to miss the way she startled when he entered a room unexpectedly, or how she kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see someone watching from the street below. But he was also patient enough not to push for answers until she was ready to give them, a quality that set him apart from every other man she'd known. The breaking point came on Sunday night. Isabella had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day at the Children's Museum, and Serena was cleaning up the remnants of their dinner when her phone buzzed for the 15th time that day. This message was different, more specific, and infinitely more threatening. Cute kid. Be a real shame if something happened to her because you're too selfish to come home where you belong. Tuesday, Navy Pier, midnight. Come alone or I start making calls to people who might be very interested to know what the Torino family is really up to. Serena dropped the plate she'd been holding, and it shattered against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. She stood frozen among the ceramic shards, her whole body shaking as the implications of Derek's threat sank in. He wasn't just targeting her anymore. He was threatening Isabella, an innocent 80-year-old whose only crime was befriending the wrong person. The sound of breaking dishware brought Dominic into the kitchen at a run, his expression shifting from concern to alertness as he took in the scene. Serena standing motionless among the broken pieces, her face white as paper and her hands trembling so violently she looked like she might collapse. What happened? He asked, moving carefully around the ceramic shards to reach her. Are you hurt? Serena shook her head, unable to find her voice. How could she explain that her presence in his home had just put his daughter in danger? How could she tell him that she'd brought a threat directly into the sanctuary he'd built for his family? Dominic reached out slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal, and gently took her phone from her nerveless fingers. The screen was still lit with Derek's latest message, and she watched his expression darken as he read the words. When he looked up at her again, his green-gray eyes were cold as winter stone. How long has this been going on? He asked quietly. Since Thursday, Serena whispered. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe if I ignored him, he'd give up and leave me alone. Dominic's jaw tightened, and she could see the effort it took for him to keep his voice level. Who is Derek Lawson, and why does he think he has the right to threaten my daughter? The question she'd been dreading. Serena closed her eyes and forced herself to speak, to lay bare the shame and trauma she'd been carrying for months. He's my ex-boyfriend. We were together for 2 years, and he didn't handle the breakup well. He thinks I belong to him, that I don't have the right to make my own choices about my life. That's not all, though, is it? Dominic said, and his voice carried a note of controlled fury that made her shiver. There's more you're not telling me. Serena opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing not judgment but genuine concern and something that looked like protective rage. He hurt me, she said simply. Physically, emotionally, in every way you can hurt another person. When I finally found the courage to leave, he promised he'd find me no matter where I went. He said I belonged to him, and that no one else would ever want damaged goods like me. Dominic stepped closer, moving carefully around the broken ceramic, until he was standing directly in front of her. His hands came up to frame her face gently, and she could feel the barely leashed violence in him, the way he was fighting to keep his protective instincts under control. You are not damaged goods, he said fiercely. You are brave and kind and stronger than you know. You protected my daughter when no one else would. You've brought light and laughter into our home. Whatever he did to you, whatever lies he told you about your worth, none of that is true. Serena felt tears streaming down her cheeks, though she couldn't remember when she'd started crying. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such conviction and respect. Derek had spent 2 years telling her she was worthless, that she should be grateful for any attention at all, that she was lucky he put up with someone so pathetic and damaged. He found my last address, she continued, her voice breaking. That's why I moved to the studio apartment, why I changed my phone number and my email. But he always finds me eventually. He says it's because he loves me, but it's really because he can't stand the thought of me being happy without him. Show me your arms, Dominic said suddenly. Serena hesitated, then slowly rolled up the sleeves of her cardigan. The scars were faded now, thin white lines across her wrists and forearms where Derek had grabbed her too roughly or pushed her into sharp corners. There were fingerprint bruises that had healed wrong, and one longer mark where he'd thrown a glass that shattered against her skin. Dominic studied the evidence of Derek's abuse with the same intensity he might bring to a business negotiation, his expression growing colder with each mark he catalogued. When he finally looked up at her again, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. This was the man who commanded respect through fear, who solved problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. You're moving into the guest room tonight, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Not as my employee, but as someone under my protection. Derek Lawson just made a very serious mistake by threatening my family, and I intend to make sure he understands the consequences of that choice. Dominic, I can't ask you to put yourself or Isabella at risk because of my problems. Maybe I should just leave, go somewhere far away where he can't find either of us. Absolutely not, Dominic said firmly. Running didn't work before, and it won't work now. Men like Derek don't stop hunting until someone makes them stop. And you're not alone anymore, Serena. You have people who care about you now, people who will protect you. He reached out and traced one of the faded scars on her wrist with infinite gentleness, and she felt her heart skip at the tender contact. When did you last feel truly safe? He asked softly. The question caught her off guard, and she found herself answering honestly. Here, she whispered, in your home with Isabella. These past 2 weeks are the first time in years that I felt like I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. Then stay, he said simply. Let me handle Derek. Let me protect what's mine. The possessive statement should have terrified her, should have reminded her of Derek's claims of ownership. But when Dominic said it, the words felt different. Not possessive in the sense of property, but protective in the way a man guards something precious and irreplaceable. That night, as Serena settled into the luxurious guest room with its soft linens and view of the lake, she felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. True safety. The knowledge that someone strong and capable was standing between her and the darkness. Someone who would fight for her not because he owned her but because he valued her. She was drifting off to sleep when her phone rang. Derek's number flashed on the screen, and she answered with shaking hands, knowing that ignoring him would only escalate his threats. "Hello, baby." Derek's voice was smooth and false, the tone he used when he was planning something particularly cruel. "Interesting living situation you've found yourself in. Shacking up with a mob boss and playing house with his kid. Very cozy. How did you get this number?" Serena whispered. "I have my ways. More importantly, I know where you are now, and I know what your boyfriend really does for a living. Amazing what people will tell you for the right price. I'm thinking the FBI might be very interested to learn about the Torino family's extracurricular activities. Leave them alone, Derek. This is between you and me." "Is it though? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've found yourself a sugar daddy and forgotten all about the man who loved you first. That hurts my feelings, Serena. And when my feelings get hurt, bad things tend to happen to the people responsible." The line went dead, leaving Serena staring at her phone in the darkness. Derek wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was threatening to destroy the family that had become her sanctuary, the little girl who'd come to depend on her, the man who'd offered her protection and respect when she'd forgotten such things were possible. She was reaching for her phone to call Dominic when she heard a soft knock at her door. "Come in," she called softly. Dominic entered the room wearing dark pajama pants and a t-shirt that showed off the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was tousled from sleep, but his eyes were alert and concerned. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Derek called," she admitted. "He knows about your family, about what you do. He's threatening to go to the FBI if I don't meet with him." Dominic's expression didn't change, but she could feel the dangerous energy radiating from him like heat from a fire. "Let me worry about Derek Lawson," he said quietly. "Your job is to take care of Isabella and let me take care of you. Can you do that for me, Serena?" Looking into his intense gaze, seeing the absolute conviction in his expression, Serena felt her last defenses crumble. "Yes," she whispered. "I trust you." "Good," Dominic said, reaching out to squeeze her hand gently. "Because tomorrow, I'm going to start showing Derek exactly what happens to men who threaten my family. And by the time I'm finished with him, he'll never bother you again." The phone call from Isabella's school came at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, and Serena knew before she answered that Derek had escalated beyond threatening text messages. The principal's voice was carefully controlled, the tone schools used when they were trying not to panic parents while still conveying the seriousness of a situation. "Miss Castellano, we had an incident today during dismissal. A man matching the description you provided in Isabella's safety file was observed watching the playground from across the street. Our security team approached him, but he left before they could make contact. We've increased supervision for the remainder of the week, but we wanted you to be aware." Serena's hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. Derek had found Isabella's school. He'd been watching an 80-year-old child, planning God only knew what kind of revenge against a little girl whose only crime was accepting Serena's protection. The man who'd spent 2 years telling Serena she was worthless had now sunk to targeting an innocent child to get what he wanted. Within an hour of her call to Dominic, the penthouse was swarming with men in expensive suits who spoke in low voices and carried themselves like soldiers. She watched from the kitchen as Dominic conducted what looked like a military briefing. His voice too quiet for her to hear, but his body language radiating the kind of controlled fury she'd only seen glimpses of before. When the security team finally left, Dominic found her sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, her whole body shaking with guilt and terror. She looked up when he approached, and he could see the self-recrimination in her dark eyes, the way she was already blaming herself for bringing danger into his family's life. "This is my fault," she said before he could speak. "I should leave Dominic. Tonight. Derek won't stop until he gets what he wants, and I can't let him hurt Isabella because of me. She doesn't deserve to pay for my mistakes." Dominic pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, reaching for her hands and holding them gently between his larger ones. His touch was warm and steady, an anchor in the storm of her panic and guilt. "You are not leaving," he said firmly. Isabella loves you. You're part of this family now, which means I protect you the same way I protect her. Derek Lawson doesn't get to decide who stays in my home or who cares for my daughter. But he's watching her school, Serena protested. He's willing to use a child to get to me. What kind of monster does that? The kind that won't be a problem much longer, Dominic said, and there was something in his voice that made her shiver. I've dealt with men like Derek before, Serena. Men who think they can take what doesn't belong to them, who use fear and violence to control women. They stop when someone makes them stop permanently. The implications of his words should have terrified her. A month ago, the idea of being involved with someone who solved problems through violence would have sent her running. But Derek had been escalating for days, and traditional legal solutions like restraining orders and police reports had never been effective against him. Sometimes, she was beginning to realize, the only way to stop a predator was through methods that existed outside the law. Over the next few days, an elaborate security network materialized around Isabella's daily routine. Armed drivers, plainclothes guards at the school, carefully coordinated pickups and drop-offs that ensured she was never alone or vulnerable. Isabella accepted the increased protection with the adaptability of a child who'd grown up understanding that her father's work required certain precautions. But Serena could see the questions building in her intelligent eyes. It was during one of those careful, protected afternoons that Isabella asked the question that changed everything. She was working on a math worksheet at the kitchen table while Serena prepared dinner. The domestic scene so normal and peaceful that it was easy to forget about the armed men positioned strategically around the building. Serena, Isabella said suddenly, looking up from her homework with serious dark eyes. Can I ask you something personal? Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Are you going to be my new mommy? 'Cause I was thinking about it and I really hope you are. Papa smiles more when you're here, and you're much better at braiding hair than Mrs. Chun. And you don't get nervous when I have nightmares like the other nannies did. Serena felt her heart stop, then start again in double time. She glanced toward the living room where Dominic was conducting a business call, wondering if he'd heard his daughter's innocent question and how he might react to it. What makes you think about things like that, Bella? She asked carefully, using the endearment that had slipped naturally into her vocabulary over the past weeks. Well, Isabella said pragmatically, you live with us now, and you take care of me, and Papa looks at you the way princes look at princesses in fairy tales. Plus, you're not scared of him like some people are, which means you understand that he's good on the inside even when he has to be dangerous on the outside. The 80-year-old's perception was startling in its accuracy. Serena had noticed the way Dominic looked at her, the intensity in his gaze when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She'd felt the electricity in the air when their hands touched accidentally, the way conversations lingered longer than necessary when Isabella wasn't around to provide a buffer between them. I care about you very much, Serena said honestly, and I care about your father too. But grown-up relationships are complicated, and we have to take things slowly to make sure we make good decisions. Isabella nodded sagely, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. That's smart, she said. Papa always says the best decisions are the ones you think about carefully instead of rushing. But I still hope you decide to stay forever, because I love you and I think you love us too. The simple, honest declaration made tears prick at Serena's eyes. She did love them. She loved Isabella's brilliant mind and generous heart. Loved the way the little girl had accepted her completely and without reservation. And she was falling in love with Dominic, with his fierce protectiveness and gentle hands, and the way he made her feel valued and respected instead of broken and worthless. That evening, Isabella had a sleepover at her best friend's house. A carefully orchestrated playdate that involved armed escorts and detailed security protocols, but still allowed her to maintain some semblance of normal childhood experiences. For the first time since Derek's threats had escalated, Serena and Dominic found themselves alone in the penthouse with nothing but their own carefully controlled attraction and the knowledge that everything between them was about to change. Dominic cooked dinner, moving around the kitchen with the same controlled grace he brought to everything else. Serena watched him work, noticing the way his white dress shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, the careful precision with which he prepared each ingredient. There was something deeply appealing about seeing this powerful, dangerous man engaged in something as domestic and nurturing as cooking for her. They ate by candlelight on the terrace, the Chicago skyline glittering below them like fallen stars. The wine was rich and smooth, loosening the tension that had kept them carefully distant despite the obvious attraction building between them. For the first time in weeks, they talked about things other than security protocols and Derek's threats. Dreams, fears, the childhoods that had shaped them into the adults they'd become. "My mother died when Isabella was 2, Dominic said quietly, swirling wine in his glass as he stared out at the lake. "Cancer, fast and brutal. I had no idea how to raise a little girl alone, especially not in my world. Every decision I make, every precaution I take, it's all about keeping her safe and innocent for as long as possible." "You're a wonderful father," Serena said softly. "Isabella is confident and kind and brilliant. Whatever you're doing, it's working. She talks about you constantly," Dominic replied, meeting her eyes across the small table. "You've given her something I never could, a female role model who's strong and gentle at the same time. She feels safer with you here, and so do I." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them had been willing to address directly. Serena felt her heart racing as she looked into his intense green-gray eyes, seeing her own desire reflected back at her along with something deeper and more dangerous. "Dominic," she whispered, not sure what she wanted to say but needing to break the silence that had stretched too long. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. "I know this is complicated," he said quietly. "I know my world isn't safe or normal, and I know you've been hurt badly by someone who was supposed to protect you. But what I feel for you, what's been building between us, it's not something I can ignore anymore." Serena felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than fear. She'd been holding her breath for weeks, afraid to admit how much she wanted him, how safe and cherished he made her feel. Derek had spent years convincing her that she was unworthy of love, that no decent man would ever want someone so damaged and broken. But Dominic looked at her like she was precious, like she was something worth protecting and fighting for. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you, but of how much I want this. Derek made me believe that love was supposed to hurt, that I deserved whatever pain he gave me because I wasn't good enough for anything better." Dominic stood and moved around the table, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. "Love isn't supposed to hurt, cara mia," he said softly, using the Italian endearment that made her knees weak. "Love is supposed to make you feel safe and valued and cherished. Let me show you the difference." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the brutal, claiming kisses Derek had forced on her. This was gentle and patient, a question rather than a demand. Dominic's hands cradled her face tenderly, and he pulled back immediately when she tensed, giving her space to breathe and choose rather than taking what he wanted without permission. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly, his thumb tracing her cheek with infinite care. "We can stop anytime you want. There's no pressure, no expectations. Just what feels right between us." Serena looked up into his eyes and saw nothing but patience and genuine concern for her comfort. This was what she'd forgotten existed, what Derek had stolen from her. The knowledge that her consent mattered, that her feelings and fears were important enough to consider. She reached up and touched his face, marveling at the way he leaned into her touch like it was something precious. "I don't want to stop," she whispered. "I want to remember what it feels like to be touched with kindness instead of anger." What followed was the most tender, patient seduction she'd ever experienced. Dominic led her to his bedroom, but every step was her choice. Every touch asked for permission and waited for her response. He undressed her slowly, reverently, pressing gentle kisses to each scar Derek had left and murmuring Italian endearments that made her feel beautiful instead of broken. When they finally came together, it was with a connection that transcended the physical. This wasn't just desire or lust, but something deeper and more meaningful. For the first time in her life, Serena understood what people meant when they talked about making love rather than just having sex. This was healing and hope and the promise of better things to come. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Dominic traced patterns on her bare shoulder and spoke the words she'd been afraid to hope for. "I love you," he said simply, I love your courage and your kindness and the way you protect the people you care about. I love the way Isabella lights up when you walk into a room, and I love the way you've brought joy back into our home." Serena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked up at him. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love how gentle you are with Isabella, how you've made me feel safe for the first time in years. I love that you see me as more than just damaged goods." They were wrapped in each other and the aftermath of their confession when Dominic's phone rang. He reached for it reluctantly, his expression darkening as he read the message that had just arrived from his security team. "What is it?" Serena asked, though she already knew from his expression that the peaceful bubble they'd created was about to burst. "Derek broke into your old apartment tonight," Dominic said grimly. "When he realized you weren't there, he destroyed everything you left behind and spray-painted threats on the walls. He's also been asking questions about Isabella's school schedule, trying to find patterns in our security." Serena felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "He's going to try something," she whispered. "He's done with threats and games. He's going to actually hurt someone." Dominic pulled her closer, his embrace both comforting and protective. "No," he said with quiet certainty. "He's not going to hurt anyone, because tomorrow I'm ending this permanently. Derek Lawson has made his last threat against my family." The promise should have terrified her, but all Serena felt was relief. She'd found her sanctuary, her home, her love, and she wasn't going to let Derek destroy it. Whatever Dominic had to do to protect their family, she would support him completely. Some battles could only be won by fighting fire with fire, and Derek had finally picked a fight with someone who wouldn't back down. The call came at 3:15 on a Friday afternoon, and Serena knew from the first word that Derek had finally made his move. Marcus, Dominic's head of security, spoke in the clipped, professional tone reserved for genuine emergencies, but she could hear the underlying tension that meant something had gone very wrong. "Miss Castellano, there's been an incident at Isabella's school. Derek Lawson attempted to approach her during dismissal, claiming to be a family friend sent to pick her up. Our security team intercepted him before he could make contact, but he managed to escape in the confusion. Mr. Torino is en route to collect Isabella personally, and we're implementing lockdown protocols immediately." Serena dropped the book she'd been reading, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the phone. Derek had actually tried to take Isabella, an 80-year-old child who'd done nothing except accept Serena's love and protection. The man who'd spent months claiming to love her had just proven exactly how far he was willing to go to get revenge. "Is she safe?" Serena managed to ask. "Is Isabella okay?" "She's fine," Marcus assured her. "Scared, but unharmed. The school handled the situation professionally, and she never had direct contact with Lawson. However, we're treating this as a credible threat against both of you. Do not leave the penthouse under any circumstances until Mr. Torino returns." When Dominic arrived home an hour later with Isabella pressed close against his chest, his green-gray eyes were colder than Serena had ever seen them. He held his daughter like she was made of spun glass, one large hand smoothing her dark hair while he murmured reassurances in Italian. But over Isabella's head, his gaze met Serena's, and she saw the deadly promise there. Derek Lawson had just sealed his fate. "Papa," Isabella said quietly, her voice smaller than usual. "The man said he knew Serena, said she was expecting him to pick me up. But I remembered what you taught me about strangers, and I told the security guard right away. Did I do the right thing?" "You did exactly right, Principessa," Dominic said fiercely, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You were smart and brave just like we taught you. I'm so proud of you." Serena knelt down as Dominic set Isabella on her feet, opening her arms for one of the little girl's fierce hugs. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice thick with guilt and relief. "I'm so sorry this happened. This is all my fault." Isabella pulled back and looked at her with serious dark eyes that were far too mature for an 80-year-old. "It's not your fault that bad people do bad things," she said matter-of-factly. "Papa explained about your ex-boyfriend, how he's sick in his head and doesn't understand that you don't belong to him anymore. Some grown-ups never learn how to let go of things that were never theirs to begin with." The wisdom in those words, clearly parroted from conversations Isabella had overheard, made Serena's heart clench. This child shouldn't have to understand concepts like obsession and stalking, shouldn't have to be protected from adults who used fear and violence to get what they wanted. That evening, after Isabella was safely tucked into bed with extra security positioned outside her room, Dominic laid out the situation with brutal clarity. Derek had escalated beyond threatening messages and surveillance. He'd moved to active attempts at kidnapping, which meant the threat was now immediate and lethal. "He's not going to stop, Serena," Dominic said quietly as they sat in his study, brandy glasses untouched on the table between them. "Today proved that he's willing to use Isabella to get to you, which means every day he's free is another day my daughter is in danger. I can't allow that to continue." Serena understood what he wasn't saying directly. Derek would be eliminated permanently and probably within the next 24 hours. A month ago, the thought would have horrified her. Now, after watching Isabella's terrified face and hearing the tremor in her voice, Serena felt nothing but grim satisfaction at the prospect of Derek finally facing consequences for his actions. "What do you need me to do?" she asked simply. "Trust me," Dominic replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And be ready for this to end permanently. By tomorrow night, Derek Lawson will no longer be a threat to anyone." But Derek, as it turned out, wasn't willing to wait for Dominic to come to him. The security breach happened at 2 in the morning, when most normal people were deeply asleep. Serena woke to the sound of splintering wood and shouting voices, her heart immediately jumping to her throat as she recognized the chaos of a forced entry. Someone had gotten past the building's security, past the armed guards, past all the layers of protection that were supposed to keep them safe. She was reaching for her phone when her bedroom door burst open, and Derek Lawson stepped into the room like something out of her worst nightmares. He looked terrible, unshaven and wildeed, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd been sleeping rough for days. In his right hand, he carried a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade that glinted in the moonlight streaming through her windows. "Hello, baby," he said with the same false sweetness she remembered from their worst fights. "Miss me?" Serena couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the man who'd terrorized her for years and was now standing in the sanctuary she'd thought was impregnable. How was he here? How had he gotten past Dominic's security? And where was Dominic now? "Surprised to see me?" Derek asked, stepping further into the room and closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "Your boyfriend's security isn't as good as he thinks it is. Amazing what a man can accomplish with the right motivation and a few well-placed bribes." He moved closer to the bed, and Serena scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the headboard. The knife in his hand was steady, professional, the weapon of someone who'd thought carefully about how to use it. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment break-in. This was planned, calculated revenge. 2 years, Derek continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of her impending murder. 2 years I spent taking care of you, putting up with your depression and your fears, and your pathetic need for constant reassurance. And this is how you repay me? Running off to play house with some mob boss and his brat? "He's not a mob boss," Serena whispered, though even as she said it, she knew the distinction didn't matter to Derek. Whatever Dominic's business involved, it clearly operated outside traditional legal boundaries, which made him exactly the kind of target Derek would love to destroy. "Please," she tried again, her voice stronger now. "You don't want to do this, Derek. If you hurt me, if you hurt them, Dominic will hunt you down. You know what kind of man he is, what he's capable of. Just leave now, and maybe you can disappear before he finds you." Derek laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "Oh, but I do want to do this, baby. I want to do this very much. See, I've been thinking about our relationship, about the mistakes I made in managing you properly. I was too soft, too forgiving. I let you think you had choices when what you really needed was firm guidance." The knife moved closer, and Serena could smell the unwashed scent of him, the familiar combination of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne that had once been comforting and was now nauseating. This was how she was going to die, she realized with surprising calm. Murdered by a man who'd convinced himself that violence was love, that possession was protection. "You belong to me," Derek continued, his voice dropping to the intimate whisper he'd used during sex, during fights, during the times when he'd convinced her that she was lucky to have someone who cared enough to correct her flaws. You've always belonged to me, even when you were too stupid to appreciate what you had. But don't worry, baby. After tonight, after I finish cleaning up the mess you've made, we can start over. Just you and me, the way it should have been from the beginning. The bedroom door exploded inward with enough force to splinter the frame, and Dominic Torino stepped into the room like an avenging angel clothed in black silk pajamas. His hair was disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were coldly alert, and in his hands was a gun that looked both expensive and extremely deadly. "Step away from her," Dominic said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men weep and beg for mercy. "Now." Derek spun around, the knife still gripped in his hand but his confidence wavering as he faced the full force of Dominic's fury. "So nice of you to join us," he said, trying to maintain his earlier bravado. "I was just having a conversation with my girlfriend about her future living arrangements." "Your girlfriend?" Dominic repeated, and Serena could hear death in his voice, cold and certain and absolutely final. "Is that what you call the woman you've terrorized for months? The woman you threatened to murder? The woman who ran across half the country to escape your abuse?" "She belongs to me," Derek snarled, raising the knife higher. "We have history together, commitments you wouldn't understand. I'm not leaving here without her." "You're not leaving here at all," Dominic said with quiet certainty. "You threatened my daughter. You broke into my home. You put a knife to the woman I love. Those aren't mistakes I forgive, Mr. Lawson." Derek's eyes darted between Dominic's gun and Serena's terrified face, clearly trying to calculate his odds of survival. She could see the moment when desperation overtook reason, when he decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. He lunged toward the bed with the knife raised, and Serena screamed as she rolled sideways, trying to avoid the blade that was arcing toward her chest. But Derek never reached her. Dominic moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd been trained in violence, and the sound that filled the room wasn't the whistle of a knife through air, but the sharp crack of a gunshot. Derek collapsed to the floor, the knife spinning away across the hardwood. Blood spread in an expanding pool beneath him, and his eyes were already going glassy as Serena stared down at the man who'd terrorized her for so long. It was over. Finally, permanently, completely over. Dominic was beside her in an instant, his hands running over her frantically as he checked for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did he cut you?" "Carmia, talk to me." "I'm okay," Serena managed, though her voice sounded strange and distant even to her own ears. "He didn't hurt me. You stopped him in time." Dominic pulled her against his chest, and she could feel the tremor in his hands as he held her. She could have lost him too, she realized. If Derek had been quicker, more skilled, luckier, she might be looking down at Dominic's blood instead of her tormentors. "It's over," Dominic murmured into her hair, his voice thick with relief and residual fury. "He'll never threaten you again, never hurt you again. You're safe now, forever." The cleanup was swift and professional, the kind of efficient disposal that spoke to years of experience in making problems disappear permanently. Within an hour, Derek's body was gone, the blood cleaned up, and the broken door frame repaired. To anyone who asked, Derek Lawson had simply vanished, another missing person in a city full of people who sometimes chose to disappear. Isabella slept through the entire incident, exhaustion and the white noise machine in her room protecting her from the violence that had erupted just down the hall. When she woke the next morning, her biggest concern was whether Serena would make pancakes for breakfast, blissfully unaware that the man who'd threatened her safety was no longer a problem. The next 3 months passed in a blur of healing and growing closer as a family. Derek's death had freed Serena from years of looking over her shoulder, of jumping at unexpected sounds and checking locks obsessively. For the first time since adolescence, she felt truly safe, truly free to build the life she wanted instead of constantly running from the one she was trying to escape. Dominic was patient and understanding as she worked through the lingering trauma of Derek's final attack. Some nights she woke up screaming, reliving the moment when she'd seen the knife in Derek's hand and known she was about to die. But Dominic was always there, holding her gently and whispering reassurances until the nightmares faded and she could sleep again. Isabella, with the resilience of childhood, bounced back from her own trauma quickly. She talked matter-of-factly about the bad man who tried to take her, but her primary concern seemed to be whether Serena was going to stay with them permanently now that the danger was over. The little girl had clearly been worried that once Derek was no longer a threat, Serena might leave their safe haven for a more normal life. The proposal, when it came, was orchestrated entirely by Isabella and was the most romantic thing Serena had ever experienced. She came home from grocery shopping to find candles lit throughout the penthouse and Isabella waiting in the foyer wearing her best dress and a conspiratorial smile. "Papa has something very important to ask you," Isabella announced solemnly. "I helped him pick out the ring, and I told him exactly what to say, so I hope you like it." Dominic appeared from the living room wearing a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of nervous determination that was completely at odds with his usual calm confidence. In his hands was a small velvet box that made Serena's heart stop, then start again at double speed. "Serena Castellano," he said formally, dropping to one knee right there in the foyer while Isabella bounced excitedly beside him. "You saved my daughter, brought joy back into our home, and taught me what it means to love someone completely and without reservation. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and Isabella's mother officially?" The ring was stunning. A classic solitaire with a diamond so brilliant, it seemed to capture all the light in the room. But it was the hope in Dominic's eyes and the way Isabella was practically vibrating with excitement that made Serena's decision easy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, absolutely yes." Isabella cheered and threw herself into Serena's arms, while Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly. "We're going to be a real family," Isabella said happily. "Papa and Mama and me, just like in the fairy tales except better because this is real life." The wedding 6 months later was small but elegant, held in the garden of Dominic's estate with only his closest associates and Isabella as flower girl. Serena wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly, and carried white roses mixed with the wildflowers that Isabella had insisted on adding because they looked happy and free. Mrs. Chun cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while she watched the family she'd helped raise finally become complete. The old housekeeper had been delighted when Dominic announced the engagement, declaring that she'd known from the first day that Serena was meant to be part of their lives. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Dominic kissed her with a passion that made the small gathering of guests cheer and Isabella giggle with embarrassment. This was what love was supposed to feel like, Serena thought, as she melted into her new husband's embrace. Safe and cherished and absolutely certain that tomorrow would be better than today. The honeymoon in Tuscany was magical. 2 weeks of exploring medieval towns and drinking wine and making love in a villa that overlooked rolling hills covered in vineyards. But what Serena remembered most clearly was the way Dominic looked at her. Like she was the most precious thing in his world. Like he couldn't quite believe she was really his. When they returned home, tanned and relaxed and more deeply in love than ever, Isabella greeted them at the airport with a sign that read "Welcome home Mama and Papa" in glittery letters she'd made herself. The little girl had grown during their absence, but more importantly, she'd settled into calling Serena Mama with the easy acceptance of a child who'd never doubted that this was how their family was meant to be. 1 year later, Serena stood in the nursery that had been Isabella's playroom, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly as she watched her stepdaughter carefully arrange stuffed animals in the new crib. At 9, Isabella was the perfect big sister, full of helpful advice about babies and excited plans for teaching her new sibling everything from Italian phrases to proper tea party etiquette. The baby kicked strongly against Serena's palm, and she smiled as she imagined the chaos and joy that would fill their home in just a few more months. A little boy, according to the ultrasound, who would grow up surrounded by love and protection and the knowledge that family meant everything. Dominic appeared in the doorway, still wearing his business suit but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed from Isabella's enthusiastic hug when he'd arrived home. He moved to stand behind Serena, his arms encircling her waist and his hands covering hers on her belly. "How are my 3 favorite people doing today?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We're perfect," Serena replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. Better than I ever dreamed possible. Isabella looked up from her arrangement of stuffed animals and beamed at them. When baby Marco gets here, I'm gonna teach him how to be brave like Mama. She protected me when I was scared, and now I'll protect him when he's little and needs help. Watching her stepdaughter's confident smile, feeling her husband's strong arms around her, and their son moving beneath her heart, Serena marveled at how completely her life had transformed. A year ago, she'd been a terrified waitress with nowhere to run and no hope for the future. Now she was a wife, a mother, the center of a family built on love and mutual protection rather than fear and control. That night, as she tucked Isabella into bed and listened to the little girl's prayers of gratitude for their family, Serena thought about the moment that had changed everything. One act of courage, one decision to protect a frightened child instead of looking the other way. Sometimes the smallest choices led to the biggest changes, and sometimes standing up for what was right was the first step toward finding everything you'd never known you were looking for. As she settled into her husband's arms in their bedroom, surrounded by the quiet security of their home, Serena whispered a prayer of her own. Gratitude for the love that had saved her, for the family that had chosen her, and for the strength she'd found when it mattered most. She'd learned that true protection wasn't about possession or control, but about creating a safe space where love could grow and flourish. Have you ever wondered what drives someone to risk everything to protect the people they love? Maybe you've felt that fierce instinct yourself, that willingness to stand between danger and the ones who matter most. That protective love, that courage in the face of fear, that's what builds real families and creates lasting happiness. It's what transforms broken people into whole ones, and what proves that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with a single moment of bravery in the face of cruelty.